A beggar pays the bill of an old woman thrown out of a restaurant. The next day he is surrounded by people in suits. The neon lights of Mabel's diner flickered weakly in the gathering dusk, casting an eerie glow on the rain-slicked sidewalk. Inside, the clatter of dishes and murmur of conversation provided a stark contrast to the somber mood of the hunched figure seated at a corner table. Frank Miller tugged nervously at the frayed cuffs of his worn jacket, acutely aware of the disapproving glances from the other patrons. His weathered face bore the marks of a hard life lived on the streets, but his eyes still held a spark of dignity that refused to be extinguished. As he nursed a cup of lukewarm coffee, his one indulgence for the day, Frank's thoughts turned to his daughter Lily. At just 12 years old, she was the light of his life, the reason he got up each morning to face another day of struggle and uncertainty. He smiled faintly, remembering how she had hugged him fiercely that morning before heading off to school, her backpack nearly as big as she was. A commotion near the entrance drew Frank from his reverie. An elderly woman, her silver hair neatly pinned back in a bun, was engaged in a heated discussion with the restaurant manager. "I'm telling you, young man, I have the money to pay for my meal," the woman insisted, her voice quavering with a mix of indignation and embarrassment. "If you'll just let me look through my purse again." The manager, a portly man with a receding hairline, shook his head impatiently. "Ma'am, you've been through that purse 3 times already. If you can't pay, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Frank watched as the woman's shoulders slumped into feet. Without thinking, he rose from his seat and approached the pair. "Excuse me," he said quietly, reaching into his pocket. "I couldn't help overhearing. Please allow me to take care of the lady's bill." The manager's eyebrows shot up in surprise as Frank pressed a crumpled $20 bill into his hand. It was money he had been saving for Lily's birthday present, but something about the old woman's dignity and the face of humiliation struck a chord within him. The elderly woman turned to Frank, her eyes wide with astonishment. "Young man, I don't know what to say. This is most unexpected." Frank smiled gently. "It's nothing, ma'am, we all need a little help sometimes." As the manager reluctantly processed the payment, the woman introduced herself as Margaret Thornton. "I can't thank you enough for your kindness," she said, her voice warm with gratitude. "I feel so foolish. I must have left my wallet at home." "It's no trouble at all, Mrs. Thornton," Frank assured her. "Do you live far? Perhaps I could walk you home, just to make sure you arrive safely." Margaret hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "That would be lovely, thank you. It's not too far, just a few blocks from here." As they stepped out into the cool evening air, Frank couldn't help but marvel at the strange turns life could take. Here he was, a man who usually inspired wariness or pity in others, escorting a well-dressed elderly woman home like a gentleman. Their conversation as they walked was stilted at first, but gradually grew more relaxed. Margaret spoke of her late husband, a kind man who had passed away several years earlier, and her grandson, a doctor at the local hospital. "Thomas is all I have left now," she said, a note of pride creeping into her voice. "He's always so busy with his patients, but he makes time to check on me every week." Frank nodded, thinking of Lily. "Family is everything," he agreed softly. As they approached a stately brownstone, Margaret paused. "This is me," she said, gesturing to the building. "Would you like to come in for a cup of tea? It's the least I can do to thank you for your kindness." Frank was about to decline. He needed to get back to the shelter before they gave away his bed for the night, when the front door opened, revealing a tall, handsome man in his early 30s. "Grandma," the man called out, his brow furrowed with concern. "I've been trying to call you, is everything all right?" Margaret waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, Thomas, don't fuss. I am perfectly fine, thanks to this kind gentleman here. Frank, this is my grandson, Dr. Thomas Thornton. Thomas, this is Frank Miller. He came to my rescue at the diner when I realized I'd forgotten my wallet." Thomas's eyes widened as he took in Frank's appearance, but to his credit he didn't hesitate to extend his hand. "Mr. Miller, thank you for helping my grandmother. Please, won't you come in? I insist on repaying you for your kindness." Frank looked from Margaret's warm smile to Thomas's earnest expression, and felt something shift within him. Perhaps, he thought, this was the beginning of something unexpected, something that could change everything. With a slight nod, Frank followed them into the house, unaware that this simple act of kindness was about to set in motion a chain of events that would alter the course of all their lives forever. The weeks following Frank's chance encounter with Margaret Thornton passed in a blur of unexpected developments. What had started as a simple act of kindness blossomed into a friendship that defied social boundaries and preconceptions. Margaret, touched by Frank's generosity, had insisted on introducing him to various charitable organizations in the city. Through her connections, Frank managed to secure a part-time job as a janitor at a local community center. It wasn't much, but it was a start. A glimmer of hope in a life that had known too little of it. For Lily, the change in their circumstances was nothing short of miraculous. The community center offered after-school programs, giving her a safe place to stay while Frank worked. She threw herself into art classes and tutoring sessions with an enthusiasm that brought tears to her father's eyes. But perhaps the most surprising development was the friendship that formed between Frank and Thomas Thornton. Despite their vastly different backgrounds, the two men found common ground in their shared experiences of single fatherhood. Frank with Lily and Thomas with his medical career, which he often described as his demanding child. One crisp autumn evening, Frank and Lily were invited to dinner at the Thornton residence. As Lily chatted excitedly with Margaret about her latest art project, Frank and Thomas stood in the kitchen preparing the meal. "You know," Thomas said, a thoughtful expression on his face as he chopped vegetables. "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad Grandma forgot her wallet that day at the diner." Frank chuckled, stirring the pot of soup simmering on the stove. "Life has a funny way of working out sometimes," he agreed. "I never thought I'd be standing in a kitchen like this, cooking dinner with a doctor." Thomas's expression grew serious. "Frank, I hope you know how much your friendship has meant to Grandma. And to me. It's been a long time since I've seen her this happy." Frank felt a lump form in his throat. "Your grandmother is an extraordinary woman," he said softly. "And you? Well, you've given Lily and me a chance we never thought we'd have." "I don't know how to thank you." Thomas waved away his words. "There's no need for thanks between friends," he said firmly. "We're family now, all of us." As they sat down to dinner, the warmth and laughter filling the room, Frank marveled at how much his life had changed in such a short time. For the first time in years he dared to hope for a better future. Not just for Lily but for himself as well. But life, as Frank well knew, had a way of throwing curveballs when you least expected them. And even as he basked in the glow of newfound friendship and security, a shadow loomed on the horizon. One that would test the bonds they had forged in ways none of them could have imagined. The first sign of trouble came on a blustery November morning. Frank had just dropped Lily off at school when his phone rang. A luxury he'd only recently been able to afford. It was Thomas, his voice tight with worry. "Frank, it's Lily," Thomas said without preamble. "The school just called me. She collapsed during gym class. They're bringing her to the hospital now." Frank felt the world tilt beneath his feet. "What is she? Is she okay?" "I don't know yet," Thomas replied, his doctor's training evident in his calm tone. "But I'll be waiting for her when she arrives. Can you get here?" "I'm on my way," Frank said, already breaking into a run. The next few hours passed in a blur of fear and uncertainty. Lily was rushed into emergency surgery. Her young body betrayed by an undiagnosed heart condition that had lain dormant until now. Frank paced the waiting room, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Margaret arrived, her face pale with concern, and wrapped him in a fierce hug. "She'll be all right," Margaret murmured, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Thomas is the best surgeon in the hospital. If anyone can help Lily, it's him." Frank nodded mutely, clinging to her words like a lifeline. As the hours ticked by, he found himself bargaining with a god he'd long since stopped believing in, promising anything if only his little girl would be okay. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Thomas emerged from the operating room. His scrubs were splattered with blood, and exhaustion lined his face. But there was a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "She's going to be fine," he announced. And Frank felt his knees go weak with relief. "It was touch and go for a while, but we managed to repair the defect. She'll need to take it easy for a while. But with proper care, she should make a full recovery." Frank couldn't speak, overcome with emotion. He simply reached out and pulled Thomas into a fierce embrace, tears streaming down his face. As the days passed and Lily regained her strength, Frank was overwhelmed by the outpouring of support from their newfound family. Margaret practically moved into the hospital, keeping Lily entertained with stories and games. Thomas went above and beyond his duties as a doctor, ensuring Lily received the best possible care. It was during one of these long nights at the hospital that Frank finally found the words to express his gratitude. "I don't know what I would have done without you," he said softly, looking at Thomas and Margaret. "Both of you. You've given us so much more than just medical care. You've given us a family." Margaret reached out and squeezed his hand. "Oh my dear," she said, her eyes twinkling. "That's what family does. We stand by each other through thick and thin." As Lily's recovery progressed, Frank dared to believe that perhaps the worst was behind them. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. For even as they celebrated Lily's return to health, a new tragedy was waiting in the wings. One that would shake their newfound family to its very core. The first hints of spring were in the air when tragedy struck without warning. Margaret, ever the independent spirit, had insisted on running her own errands, despite Thomas and Frank's offers of assistance. It was on one such outing that the unthinkable happened. A distracted driver, more focused on his phone than the road, ran a red light at a busy intersection. Margaret, crossing the street with her arms full of groceries, never saw the car coming. The news reached Frank and Thomas as they were sharing a quiet lunch at the diner, where their unlikely friendship had begun. Thomas's phone rang and Frank watched as the color drained from his friend's face. "Grandma's been in an accident," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're taking her to the hospital now." The next few hours passed in a haze of fear and disbelief. Frank called in favors at work to stay with Lily, who was still recovering at home, while he accompanied Thomas to the hospital. As they waited for news, Frank found himself in the unfamiliar position of being the strong one, offering what comfort he could to his distraught friend. But despite the best efforts of the medical team, many of whom knew and loved Margaret, there was nothing to be done. The injuries were too severe, the damage too extensive. As the machines monitoring Margaret's vital signs fell silent, Thomas collapsed into Frank's arms, his body racked with sobs. In the days that followed, Frank watched helplessly as Thomas withdrew into himself, consumed by grief. The vibrant, compassionate doctor who had saved Lily's life was replaced by a shell of a man, going through the motions of life without really living. The funeral was a somber affair, attended by what seemed like half the city. Margaret, it turned out, had touched far more lives than Frank had realized. As he listened to story after story of her kindness and generosity, he felt a renewed sense of gratitude for having known her, however briefly. But even as he mourned, Frank couldn't shake the nagging worry about Thomas. His friend had barely spoken since Margaret's death, throwing himself into his work with a single-minded intensity that bordered on obsession. It was Lily, still pale and weak from her own ordeal, who finally broke through Thomas's defenses. On a rain-soaked afternoon a week after the funeral, she insisted on visiting him, tugging Frank along despite his reservations. When Thomas opened the door, the sight that greeted them was shocking. The usually immaculate apartment was a mess, with unwashed dishes piled in the sink and clothes strewn about. Thomas himself looked like he hadn't slept or shaved in days, but Lily, with the fearless compassion of youth, marched right up to him and wrapped her arms around his waist. "I'm sorry about your grandma," she said simply. "She was really nice, I miss her too." Something in Thomas seemed to crumble at her words. He sank to his knees, hugging Lily tightly as tears streamed down his face. Frank watched, his own eyes stinging, as his daughter comforted the man who had saved her life. From that day forward, something shifted in their relationship. The bonds of friendship that had been forged in crisis were tempered by shared grief, emerging stronger and deeper than before. Frank and Lily became frequent visitors to Thomas's apartment, bringing home-cooked meals and, more importantly, the warmth of family that Thomas so desperately needed. As spring gave way to summer, Thomas slowly began to emerge from his cocoon of grief. He spoke of Margaret often, sharing stories that made them laugh and cry in equal measure. And though the pain of her loss never truly faded, he found solace in the family he had gained. A family bound not by blood, but by choice and circumstance. One balmy evening, as they sat on Thomas's balcony watching the sunset, Frank turned to his friend with a sad smile. She'd be proud of you, he said softly, the way you've carried on helping people even through your own pain. That's the Thomas she raised. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. I couldn't have made it through this without you and Lily, he admitted. You've become the family I needed, even when I didn't know I needed it. As they sat there in companionable silence, Frank reflected on the strange twists of fate that had brought them to this point. From a chance encounter born of kindness, to a friendship forged in the crucible of tragedy, their lives had become inextricably intertwined. But even as they found comfort in their newfound family, none of them could have predicted the challenges that lay ahead. Challenges that would test their bonds in ways they never imagined, and force them to confront painful truths about themselves and each other. For life, as Frank had learned time and time again, had a way of throwing curveballs when you least expected them, and the biggest test of all was yet to come. The years passed, bringing with them a sense of stability that Frank had once thought impossible. Lily blossomed into a vibrant young woman, her artistic talents flourishing under the nurturing environment of their newfound family. Frank's part-time job had evolved into a full-time position as facilities manager at the community center, allowing them to move into a modest but comfortable apartment. Thomas remained a constant presence in their lives, his initial grief over Margaret's loss gradually softening into fond remembrance. He took on the role of unofficial uncle to Lily, encouraging her dreams and offering guidance as she navigated the choppy waters of adolescence. It was during Lily's senior year of high school that the first ripples of discord appeared in their carefully constructed peace. She had begun dating a boy named Jake, a charming, ambitious student with dreams of becoming a lawyer. Frank, still protective of his daughter despite her growing independence, found himself struggling to accept this new presence in Lily's life. I don't know, Thomas, Frank confided one evening as they shared a beer on his small balcony. There's something about that kid that doesn't sit right with me. Thomas listened patiently, a thoughtful expression on his face. It's natural to be protective, Frank, he said gently. But Lily's growing up. We have to trust her judgment. Frank sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. I know. It's just, after everything we've been through, I can't help but worry. Little did Frank know that his concerns were about to be amplified beyond his wildest fears. It was a crisp autumn evening when the call came. Frank was just finishing up at the community center when his phone rang, displaying an unfamiliar number. Mr. Miller, a grave voice said. This is Officer Ramirez from the City Police Department. There's been an accident. Your daughter Lily is being taken to Memorial Hospital. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Frank listened to the officer's words. Lily and Jake had been in a car crash. Jake had walked away with minor injuries. But Lily. Frank's hands shook as he dialed Thomas's number. His friend's calm voice a lifeline in the storm of his panic. Thomas promised to meet him at the hospital. His medical expertise a small comfort in the face of the unknown. The next few days passed in a blur of beeping machines and hushed conversations. Lily lay unconscious, her face pale and bruised against the stark white of the hospital sheets. Frank alternated between pacing the halls and sitting vigil at her bedside, his mind a whirlwind of fear and anger. Jake had been at the wheel when the accident occurred, though the police report indicated it had been just that, an accident. Frank couldn't shake the feeling that the boy was somehow to blame. His protective instincts, honed by years of struggling to keep Lily safe, kicked into overdrive. It was on the third day, as Frank was returning from a much-needed coffee run, that he overheard a conversation that would change everything. Jake was speaking to his parents in hushed tones just outside Lily's room. I can't stay here anymore, Jake was saying, his voice trembling. Mr. Miller looks at me like he wants to kill me. And Lily. What if she doesn't wake up? What if she's different when she does? I can't handle this pressure. Frank felt a white-hot rage building in his chest. Before he could stop himself, he stormed around the corner, fixing Jake with a glare that made the boy flinch. You want to leave? Frank snarled, his voice low and dangerous. Then go. Get out of here and don't come back. Lily deserves better than a coward who runs at the first sign of trouble. Jake's parents started to protest, but Frank cut them off with a raised hand. I want him gone, he said firmly. Now, as Jake and his family retreated, Thomas appeared at Frank's side, his face creased with concern. "Frank, what happened? What did you do?" Frank turned to his friend, his eyes blazing with a mix of anger and fear. "I protected my daughter," he said simply. "That boy doesn't deserve her." Thomas opened his mouth to respond, but at that moment, a commotion from Lily's room drew their attention. Rushing inside, they found her stirring, her eyelids fluttering as she fought her way back to consciousness. The joy of Lily's awakening was tempered by the long road of recovery ahead. As the days turned into weeks, Frank watched his daughter struggle with physical therapy and the emotional toll of the accident. But there was one question she asked repeatedly that filled him with dread. "Where's Jake? Why hasn't he come to see me?" Unable to face the truth of his actions, Frank constructed a lie. He told Lily that Jake had been forced to leave town suddenly due to a family emergency. It was easier, he reasoned, than admitting he had driven away the boy she loved. Thomas, witness to the deception, pulled Frank aside after one such conversation. "Frank, you can't keep lying to her," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Lily deserves the truth." But Frank, blinded by his need to protect his daughter, couldn't see past his own fears. "She's not ready," he insisted. The truth would only hurt her more right now. As Lily slowly regained her strength, Frank clung to his deception, unaware that with each lie, he was creating a rift that would soon threaten to tear apart the family they had built. Months passed and Lily's recovery progressed steadily. Physical scars faded, but the emotional wounds lingered, hidden beneath the surface. Frank watched his daughter with a mixture of pride and concern, noting the shadows that sometimes flickered behind her smile. The lie about Jake's absence had grown more elaborate over time, with Frank fabricating updates about the boy's supposed family crisis. Thomas, increasingly uncomfortable with the deception, had withdrawn somewhat from their daily lives, citing increased demands at the hospital. It was a crisp spring morning when the carefully constructed facade began to crumble. Frank was tidying up the apartment, while Lily was at a physical therapy session when he heard a knock at the door. Opening it, he found himself face to face with Jake. The young man looked older somehow, the carefree boy replaced by someone carrying the weight of guilt and regret. "Mr. Miller," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. I need to see Lily." To apologize, to explain. Frank felt a surge of panic, quickly followed by anger. "You need to leave," he growled, moving to close the door. "Lily's better off without you." But Jake's foot wedged in the doorway, his expression hardening. "No, Mr. Miller, I'm not leaving until I talk to Lily. She deserves the truth." The commotion drew the attention of their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Gonzalez, who poked her head out into the hallway. Her eyes widened as she recognized Jake. "Oh, you're back," she exclaimed. "Lily will be so happy. She's been so worried about you, dear." Frank's blood ran cold as he realized the precarious situation. Before he could formulate a response, he heard the elevator ding, followed by the sound of familiar footsteps. Lily rounded the corner, her face lighting up with shock and joy as she saw Jake. "Jake," she gasped. "You're here? But I thought—" Dad said. The look of confusion on Lily's face quickly turned to hurt as she pieced together the truth. Her eyes darted between Jake and Frank, filling with tears of betrayal. "You lied to me," she whispered, her voice cracking. "All this time you lied." What followed was a storm of emotions, Lily's anger and hurt, Jake's remorse and explanations, and Frank's desperate attempts to justify his actions. But with each word, Frank could see the trust in his daughter's eyes dimming, replaced by a pain that cut him to his core. In the end, Lily fled the apartment, brushing past a concerned Thomas, who had arrived in the midst of the chaos. Jake, after a long look at Frank, followed her, leaving Frank alone with the consequences of his deception. Thomas, his face etched with disappointment, shook his head slowly. "Oh, Frank," he sighed. "What have you done?" The days that followed were a blur of unanswered calls and sleepless nights. Lily had gone to stay with a friend, refusing to speak to Frank despite his numerous attempts to explain. Jake, true to his word, had told her everything. His initial cowardice, Frank's ultimatum, and his eventual decision to return and make things right. It was Thomas who finally managed to broker a meeting between father and daughter, arranging for them to meet on neutral ground, the diner where their journey had begun all those years ago. Lily arrived first, her face a mask of carefully controlled emotion. Frank, his heart hammering in his chest, slid into the booth across from her. For a long moment neither spoke, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavy between them. "I'm so sorry, Lily," Frank finally said, his voice rough with emotion. "I thought I was protecting you, but I was wrong. I was so afraid of losing you that I ended up pushing you away." Lily's eyes, so like her mother's, filled with tears. "You should have trusted me, Dad," she said softly. "I'm not a little girl anymore. I can make my own decisions, even if they're sometimes the wrong ones." Frank nodded, feeling the full weight of his mistakes. "I know that now," he admitted. "I forgot that the strongest thing about us was always our honesty with each other. Can you ever forgive me?" Lily was quiet for a long moment, absently tracing patterns on the Formica tabletop. When she finally looked up, there was a mixture of pain and love in her eyes. "I don't know, Dad," she said honestly. "I need time and space to figure things out for myself." Though her words felt like a knife to his heart, Frank nodded in understanding. "Whatever you need," he said softly. "I'll be here when you're ready." As Lily stood to leave, she paused, then leaned down to place a gentle kiss on Frank's cheek. "I love you, Dad," she whispered. "But I need to find my own way now." Frank watched her go, his vision blurring with tears. He sat there long after she had disappeared from view, contemplating the high cost of fear and the long road to rebuilding trust. It was in this moment of quiet reflection that Frank realized the true meaning of family. Not just the bonds of blood, but the connections forged through love, honesty, and the courage to face hard truths together. And though the path ahead seemed daunting, he vowed to do whatever it took to heal the rifts his actions had caused. Little did Frank know that life had one more surprise in store. A twist of fate that would test their newly fragile relationships and offer a chance at redemption he never saw coming. The seasons changed, and with them the landscape of Frank's life. Lily had made good on her need for space, moving to a nearby city to pursue her art studies. Their conversations, once so easy and frequent, had become stilted and sporadic. Frank found himself counting the days between phone calls, cherishing each brief connection while respecting his daughter's need for independence. Thomas remained a steady presence, though their relationship had been strained by the aftermath of Frank's deception. Slowly, they were rebuilding the easy camaraderie they had once shared, finding common ground in their mutual concern for Lily. It was a crisp autumn morning, eerily reminiscent of the day Margaret had entered their lives when Frank's phone rang. His heart leapt at the sight of Lily's name on the screen. "Dad!" Lily's voice was trembling, a mix of fear and excitement that immediately set Frank on edge. I need to see you. Can you come to my apartment? There's something I need to tell you." Frank's mind raced through possibilities as he made the hour-long drive to Lily's small studio apartment. Had something happened? Was she in trouble? The scenarios grew increasingly dire until he found himself standing outside her door, hand poised to knock. Lily opened the door and Frank's breath caught in his throat. She looked different, radiant somehow, despite the nervousness evident in her eyes. "Come in, Dad," she said softly, stepping aside to let him enter. The apartment was cluttered with half-finished canvases and art supplies, a testament to Lily's flourishing talent. But it was the small sonogram picture propped up on the easel that drew Frank's attention. "Lily," he breathed, his eyes darting between the image and his daughter's face. "Are you?" Lily nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I'm pregnant, Dad," she confirmed. About 3 months along, Frank felt a whirlwind of emotions, joy, fear, concern, and an overwhelming surge of love for his daughter. "Oh, sweetheart," he said. Opening his arms, Lily stepped into his embrace, and for a moment it was as if no time had passed, as if the rift between them had never existed. As they settled on Lily's small couch, Frank's mind whirred with questions. "The father," he began hesitantly. "It's Jake," Lily said, her voice firm. "We've been talking again, working things out. He wants to be involved to make things right." Frank nodded slowly, tamping down the instinctive surge of protectiveness. "And what do you want, Lily?" he asked gently. Lily's hand drifted to her still flat stomach, a gesture so reminiscent of her mother that it made Frank's heart ache. "I want to have this baby," she said.